Hey guys, tonight we step into a narrow medieval lane where the sky is already a deep well of blue, and the first curfew bell rolls across the rooftops like a slow, stern wave. You stand in the doorway with the chill on your knuckles and the smoke of a dozen hearths coiling above you, and you can almost feel the town tense as shutters close and street voices drop to murmurs. The truth is simple and slightly alarming. You probably won't survive this without learning how to read the night like a book. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're listening from and what time it is on your clock, because midnight in York is not midnight in Manila, and the bells never strike the same in any two places. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The bell fades, and the town inhales. You push the bar across your door because here the boundary between safe and sorry is just 2 inches of oak. The sound you listen for next is the soft clink of the watchman's staff on cobble. The rhythm that says someone sober enough is walking the lanes. You keep your fire low, because flame is a pet fox in this world, charming when fed, ruinous when unwatched. In English towns, the very word curfew grows from the Norman French couvre-feu, cover the fire, and you obey by drawing the iron lid over the embers until they glow like cat eyes under ash. That is the respectable version. The honest version is that you also do it so you don't have to explain to your neighbors, in the freezing dawn, why their homes are now scenery for crows. You know the rules. No candle past the cup, says the house proverb, meaning once the drink is finished, the light is finished too. You have seen what a candle can do to a straw mattress when someone nods off after one last story. You have also seen horn lanterns, clever little boxes with thin scraped animal horn in place of glass, turning a flame into a milky moon you can carry. A practical marvel, and a reminder that innovation does not always wear fancy boots. You smile because your cousin swears he can judge the hour by the taste of smoke in the lane, which is ridiculous, and sadly, not entirely untrue. Along the alley, a forge throws off a stubborn blush even after the smith has quenched his last piece. Sparks climb, then fall back into the gutters, where thatch can drift like idle thoughts. You have learned that gutters are not just drains, but tinder trails if you don't keep them clear. Earlier tonight, the baker tapped ash from his oven before curfew, a careful ritual that keeps tomorrow's bread from costing the entire street. A mainstream truth's been drilled into everyone here. Medieval towns burn often, and when they burn fast. That is why ordinances appear like weeds after rain. Some places order roof repairs with tiles instead of thatch. Some move the thatchers to the edge of town. Some ban bake ovens inside the walls except for a few communal ones. Historians still argue whether these rules were enforced evenly, or only when a magistrate's patience got as thin as old leather. You feel the street by touch, cobble ridges under your shoes, the cool damp of a wall where plaster meets timber, the way sound carries between buildings that lean close enough to whisper. The geometry of danger is simple: narrow lanes, jutting upper stories, and wind that threads fire from window to window as if sewing with a hot needle. You think of the watchman again, of his lantern and hook, of the bucket ring at the well. You think of the last small blaze, when the town formed a line so clumsy and determined that you laughed and cried in the same breath. A neighbor tried to pass you 2 buckets at once because efficiency feels heroic, right up to the moment it turns into a puddle. You keep your hearth modest, a glow for blanching the night and warming your hands, nothing more. Even so, the customs that hover around flame feel almost ceremonial. You tuck a bed curtain in just so, because cloth pulls fire the way a tale pulls gossip. You set your shoes away from the embers, a practical move that you say is about drying leather, but is really about keeping your toes tomorrow. Somewhere a cat yowls, which you accept as either a rodent update or free entertainment. You brew a thin ale because water asks too many questions, and the ale gives simple answers. You take a first sip and think, if the night goes quietly, perhaps you will live to complain about the flavor. A rumor crosses the lane like an invisible bird. Someone's candle near the market went over. Someone's boy kicked a spark while trying to be helpful. Someone's voice got loud and the panic spread faster than the flame. You have learned that fear outruns fire every time. Tonight it is only talk, but you pack away your textiles, the good wool and the linen you darned by patient inches, because if misfortune visits at 3 bells, you will at least give it nothing soft to bite. The quirky truth you carry like a charm is that some households keep a damp broom by the hearth, not for sweeping but for smothering, a domestic trident against the small dragon under the grate. You step into the lane once more. The stars look close enough to borrow. Somewhere a churchman clears his throat before a midnight reading, and the town listens without meaning to. On nights like this, the quiet has weight. You can hear the creak of rope in a well, the pop of a dying spark in your own chimney, the whisper of someone scolding a candle through a cracked shutter. The watchman turns the corner, his staff marking time, and for a moment you pretend he is a metronome for every sleeping house. You nod, he nods, and both of you pretend the town is safer because you made eye contact. It helps. A little. Back by your hearth you lift the lid once, just to be certain the embers are tame. You lay the poker across the grate like a thin iron gate. You set the bucket within reach because nothing in this world feels as brave as being ready. There's a joke in your head about selling fire insurance, which you dismiss because it is ahead of its time, and your neighbors would only ask what a premium tastes like. Instead, you look at the door, listen to the wind, and let the curfew bell's last echo settle into the beams. The night is long, but you are learning its grammar. You breathe, and the town breathes with you. And for the moment, the ember stays an ember. The road smells of damp rope and tanned leather, and you feel the market thinning as wagons creak out of town earlier than usual. Traders hate to linger when whispers ride the wind, and tonight the wind says illness in 3 different accents. A cart passes with tarred barrels of herring, and you catch sight of a rope coiled like a black snake, a hitch for docking at riverside quays where goods arrive faster than news. That is how trouble wins. Grain rolls in. Cloth rolls in. Stories roll in. And sometimes, sickness sits invisible between the bales like a stowaway with patient eyes. You have learned to read the subtle signs. A chalk mark on a door. A shutter that stays closed even after sunrise. A woman who normally haggles like a champion paying full price because she is saving her breath. The town crier goes softer, not louder. When he has bad messages, and today he sounded like a man speaking through wool. The mainstream truth sits like a stone in the mind. In the 14th century, an outbreak swept from port to port and across inland roads, and in too many places it took 1/3 of the people, and sometimes more. The grief in that sentence is so large you can see it from space. You drift toward the riverside where boats bump and mutter at the wharf. Sailors cross themselves, then swear, then laugh as if laughter could push danger away like fog. A boy offers you a clove-studded pomander, a little perfumed apple of comfort for your nose. You buy it, not because you think it stops disease, but because the boy's grin is a small fire against the gray day. The quirky thing you've picked up this year is that people drop vinegar-soaked coins into buckets so merchants can fish them out with tongs. The coins emerge smelling like a salad, and somehow everyone feels braver. Rumors arrive faster than rats. Some say cats are unlucky and should be culled, which would be more persuasive if you had not watched cats perform public service in the granaries. Others say bad air flows along the river like an invisible tide and can be stopped by hanging sprigs of rosemary at door lintels. You hang the sprig anyway. No one ever lost a friend to good smells. Meanwhile, the priests move in pairs with oil and steady hands. The midwives whisper prayers between tasks, and the guilds quietly prepare to help the households already skipping a beat. You remember the last rough season when a stranger coughed outside the bathhouse, and 3 days later half the street drew water with their sleeves over their mouths. Sailors told you about distant ports shutting their gates and holding ships offshore for 40 days before anyone set foot on the quay. The idea has a certain practical poetry, an enforced pause in a world that prefers hurry. Historians still argue whether rats and their fleas carried most of the weight, or whether human lice in close quarters handed the burden along just as ruthlessly. And the debate matters because it changes how you picture the danger creeping through a town. At night you hear the low roll of a handbell and a voice asking for alms for the sick house. It does not sound like begging. It sounds like a ledger being read to the dark. You drop a small coin and think about pest houses at the edge of town, the way a city makes a border out of breathing. By dawn, you have stared at your own pulse for so long you can name its tempos. You wash with cool water that was boiled earlier and left to settle. You burn a little juniper, because your grandmother said smoke teaches air to behave, and no one argues with a grandmother who raised 7 children on a single hearth. There's a piece of plain wisdom in every market. Do not crowd. The catch is that all you do is crowd. You crowd at the well, the bake oven, the church door, the mill queue, the ale bench, the tannery wall on warm days when the wind is generous. You learn to face away when someone sneezes. You learn to touch fewer things. You sharpen your tendency to wave instead of shake hands, and you pretend this is simply your new personality. When you must visit, you choose the courtyard, not the kitchen, and you sit with your back to the draft, because it feels like one good decision among many questionable ones. Bills of mortality appear like small books no one wants to own. They feel clinical, almost tidy, which is a strange word to put next to sorrow. If numbers offer comfort, it is the comfort of a map that admits to swamps. You remember a physician with a bird-beaked mask passing through once, leather and glass and herbs tucked into the beak, a silhouette so theatrical it made children cheer and then hide. He gave advice that sounded like your aunt if your aunt had Latin and a stick. Keep distance, keep clean, keep hope. He might have added keep humor, because the street keeps that too, sly and steady, even in thin days. You think of the long chain that brings danger from a hill farm to a wharf, to a cart, to a market, to a hallway. Then you think of the other chain, the one people build on purpose. A quarried stone set into a wall that widens a lane. A new rule that keeps bake ovens apart. A guild pledge to drop off broth and bread at doorstep corners so a family can rest and not starve. These are simple counters placed gently on the table against a very large opponent. You place one more. You decide to meet your friend by the orchard gate, not the tavern, and you carry 2 cups so each of you can keep your own. The day ends with a pale sun and a faint taste of smoke. Someone says the next town closed its market and moved the stalls to the green outside the walls, where wind can read the labels for you. Someone else says the old woman who sells carrots claims she can smell illness before fever. It is possible she simply knows people. Between superstition and skill, there is a lane where survival walks with ordinary feet. You walk it too, quietly proud of how careful can look like courage when the stakes are counted in names. The river exhales, a boat creaks, and the wind pauses as if listening for the next story. Morning begins not with trumpets, but with a cough in the next bed that walks across the room and sits down in your chest like an uninvited guest. The bell for danger has long since gone quiet, yet the quiet itself carries a different trouble. You know these smaller enemies by name: the winter cough that never fully leaves, the summer fever that steals appetite and color, the rash that blooms when work is heaviest, the tiredness that cannot be napped away. They are not dramatic, and that is the trap. They tighten every knot of the day until the rope of living leaves marks on your hands. You keep a small book of remedies in your head because paper is for people with spare coins. The first page is always wind and warmth. Cover the head at night so the skull keeps its good vapors. Air the bedding on the line when the weather smiles. Hang a posy at the window not because you fear bad air will gallop in like a horse, but because rosemary and lavender make an honest room feel braver. You brew a thin gruel that looks like a humble cloud in a bowl, and sweeten it with a little honey when the throat is raw. It is not feasting, but it is persuading, and sometimes persuasion is medicine wearing an apron. The big names pass like rumors through every decade. Smallpox marks faces and moves on as if it were signing a guest book no one asked for. Pox scars become maps you can read from across a lane, proof of survival written in pale script. Coughs that last months make you measure stairs with care and stand at the bake oven just to borrow someone else's heat. There is an ordinary truth you carry, heavier than it seems. Most people die young here not because no one grows old, but because childhood is a narrow bridge over cold water. If the bridge holds, the path beyond is longer than outsiders expect. Work shapes healing. You do not lie in bed unless you are past arguing, because the cow still needs leading, and the vat still needs stirring. You barter for help the way you once bartered for nails, quietly and with thanks. A neighbor sits by for an hour while you nap, and later you mend her boy's tunic so his elbows have a second chance at decency. The midwife who helped bring your niece into the world now brings garlic syrup and a stare that makes stubborn men take the cup. She has hands like weathered wood and opinions that could straighten a board. When she says rest, you try resting, and the town grinds 1 grain slower to make room. You have seen physicians too, though not as often as stories suggest. A learned man once pressed 2 fingers to your wrist and described your pulse like a song with too much drum. He recommended bleeding, gentler than the tales, a careful letting to balance the 4 humors that every schoolboy can recite, even if he thinks phlegm sounds like a cat sneezing. You took the advice, then felt woozy, then felt a little better, then went home and did what everyone does, returned to soups, fresh air, and patience. Historians still argue whether most households could regularly consult trained physicians or relied almost entirely on midwives, apothecaries, and practical neighbors who learned by watching and remembering. In the snug corners of the parish, you find gentler care than in any book. The sisters keep a ward with clean straw and open windows when weather allows, and they sing while measuring drafts because rhythm makes kindness easier to measure. They know that a hot brick wrapped in cloth can be a friend to damp lungs, and that a poultice of bread and milk feels like a mother's hand, even to people who pretend they do not need mothering. Someone tells you a king once laid hands on the swollen necks of the scrofulous, and many swore the swelling faded as if ashamed. You do not rush to the palace. You settle for warm cloth and steady companionship, and often that is miracle enough. You have a soft spot for the eccentric. A neighbor swears that holding a live trout against the throat cures hoarseness because the fish has more water than any cough can stand. He is wrong, but he is enthusiastic, and enthusiasm has its own sparkle. You have heard of families roasting a mouse and pounding it to powder for a child's whoop, a practice that puts you off your supper, and yet somehow coexists with care that is otherwise thoughtful and tidy. People try what they can reach. The best part of the apothecary is not the jars themselves, but the hush that settles when you step inside. The way possibility smells like violets and vinegar. Illness teaches a new geometry of the night. The house sleeps in shifts to watch a fever drift up and down like a tide against the ribs. You sit by the hearth at midnight and speak softly, so the sick can float without worry. In this town, many people expect to wake between first sleep and second, and tonight you use that quiet passage to change linens, stir broth, and keep the fire level. You tell a story about a hen who decided to lay eggs only for people who wash their hands, which gets a smile, which eases your lungs a little too. You discover that humor is a window you can open even when the weather is mean. By morning, washing becomes ritual. You boil water because clear and safe are not always cousins. You scrub the cups and the spoon with salt like a tiny beach for stubbornness. You carry bedding to the line and clap it hard so dust remembers who pays rent here. The children complain about the smell of vinegar on the table, and you tell them vinegar keeps wickedness polite. They roll their eyes and eat anyway. Your joke for the day is that if neatness were a guild, you would be its grumpiest master. It is a useful grumble. The house feels brighter for it. Facts walk alongside comfort. A chronic cough may mean the lungs are working twice as hard as they should, so you break work into pieces and call the gaps wisdom. A rash can be heat, or work chafe, or a sign that tells you to fetch the midwife sooner than pride prefers. A fever demands shade, drink, and time. If none of those are easy, you make them easier one cup at a time. You learn the names of your body's small objections and treat them like neighbors who visit often and leave slowly. When at last the cough loosens and the color returns, you do not cheer. You exhale, then fold the lesson into your day, so the next time begins already halfway cured. Later, at the threshold, you watch the lane move again. Someone laughs at a joke you cannot hear. Someone carries a basket of apples that look like small dawns. The town puts its aches in its pockets and steps forward together. You do the same, grateful for ordinary breath, for a spoon that tastes like simple things, for the luxury of planning this evening's chores. Against the grand dramas of fire and pestilence, the quiet illnesses will always feel small. But you have learned their size is a trick of distance. Close up, they are the weather of a life, and you have become a careful navigator with a modest boat and a steady hand on the oar. The morning bread tastes honest and a little sad. You tear it and the crust sings. But the crumb is tight as a worried fist, and you know why. The sky has been sulking for months, tipping rain into fields that wanted sun, and the granaries show more sweep marks than grain. You measure the year by the sound of flour in a sack, and lately the sound is thin, like a rattle at the bottom of a cup. When harvest fails, everything else grows nervous. Cooks water the soup as if the well were an extra vegetable. Brewers stretch ale until it is more lecture than drink. Children chew crusts slowly like students trying to make a lesson last. You feet carry you toward the bake oven long before noon, because the line there is the town's barometer. The communal oven's mouth gapes like a red animal, heat shimmering in the lane, and the oven warden keeps a list as precise as any clerk in a court. Families arrive with dough under cloth and leave with numbers in chalk on their boards. A mainstream fact sits right beside the fire. In many towns, the assize of bread and ale set the weight of a loaf to rise and fall with the price of grain. So a penny bought more or less bread depending on the harvest. It sounds fair until you stand behind a mother counting coins with a thumb that trembles. You learn to taste compromise. Millet sneaks into wheat, oats into rye, and the miller keeps a straight face while insisting the blend builds character. You do not mind character, you mind husks. The baker stamps loaves with his mark because if a loaf proves light, the mark proves who should blush. Your favorite whisper is that some bakers hand out 13 loaves for the price of 12 when stakes are high, a cartwheel of generosity that avoids the pillory. The joke writes itself. One extra loaf is cheaper than an afternoon being stared at by every child in town. Prices do their cruel dance. The market table looks full enough, but the weights carry secrets, and the scales tilt like men who have had a long day. You know the stories of the hungry years so well they feel like small prophecies. In the second decade of the 14th century, rain-drenched northern fields, wagons sank to axles, and the Great Famine walked from village to village asking hard questions. People slaughtered draft animals they could not feed, and next year's plow found itself without shoulders to lean on. You keep that memory even if you were born long after, because towns carry old weather the way barns carry old dust. Today's weather is not catastrophe. It is the slow ache that teaches caution. You buy barley because it is cheaper, then tell yourself you prefer its chew. You queue for peas because pottage makes friends with everything, and friends are welcome at a thin table. You pick a wedge of cheese smaller than your plan, and nod bravely at the cheesemonger's opinion that quality prefers modesty. You laugh, because a joke is the one purchase that always fits. The alley smells of malt and wet wood. Somewhere a millstone hums, and you picture the grain trickling through like an hourglass that prefers bad news. Hunger rearranges the map of a day. You spread chores so the hardest ones do not land in the same hour. You teach the younger ones to measure flour with their eyes and water with their patience. You find that spices, even the cheap ones, are small magicians. A hint of caraway turns a stern loaf into something that forgives. At the bake oven, someone mentions a parish 2 valleys over, where fines for short weight can be paid in bread for the poor, which you applaud because justice tastes better when it is edible. A quirky tidbit reaches you from the guild hall. The bread inspector keeps a set of official stones to test loaves, and sometimes swears at a pebble the way a captain swears at a shoal. Scarcity makes neighbors louder and kinder in alternating breaths. The richer households send broth under lids so steam does not go cold on the way. A widow with a patch of beans leaves a sack at your door with a note that says simply, "Next year might be me." You put aside a little of your next bake for the family with the new baby and call it a festival, even though the only music is spoons on bowls. The guilds hold quiet meetings to argue about fair prices, which look noble on parchment and complicated on a wet morning when deliveries are late and tempers light quickly. You listen for the real culprit and argue with yourself about it. Was it weather, or roads, or the stubborn way power and price shake hands behind a curtain? Historians still argue whether climate shocks alone explain the worst shortages, or whether markets, wars, and tolls magnified the hurt until a bad season became a bad year for people who had nothing to sell but their strength. The sentence is long, but it matches the walk home when your basket is lighter than your hope. Back in your kitchen, you work on that hope with a ladle. Pottage thickens obediently if you give it time, so you give it time. A bone, some greens, a pinch of the good salt you pretend not to have, and suddenly supper has opinions. You cut the bread and lay the slices like roof tiles, neat and proud, and you find yourself building a small speech to give the table. You talk about how hunger sharpens the community. You talk about the cleverness of barley and the patience of beans. You make a little pun about raising dough and raising spirits, and everyone groans, which is exactly the sound you wanted. Evenings and thin months have their own flavor. People become connoisseurs of steam. You open the lid and watch faces tilt toward the pot, the way flowers tilt toward light. You pour the smallest first, then the stars of tomorrow's chores, then yourself last, because you like to finish with a flourish even if the audience is just your own stubbornness. Your hands smell of flour and wood, and the last reminder of the fire. You remind the children of the baker's mark, how every household leaves an imprint in the world, even in lean years. They roll their eyes and ask for seconds, which is the oldest compliment. Later, when quiet arrives, you count sacks by memory. One of barley, one of rye, a cup of wheat for festivals, a little oat for porridge that does not argue. You promise yourself you will check for mice at dawn and set the cat's bed nearer the bins. You promise a dozen small prudences that together feel like one good plan. Outside, wind moves through the lane with the gentle authority of a librarian. The oven mouth down the way cools to a soft glow like a thought that will not quite go to sleep. You let your shoulders drop. Tomorrow will ask for ingenuity again, and you will answer with a spoon. In bed, your stomach does its quiet arithmetic and decides you are still a person, not an appetite with shoes. Relief has a taste, and tonight it tastes like warm barley and a joke told twice because it deserves a better laugh. You close your eyes and imagine fields that do not argue with the sky. It is the oldest prayer you know, and even if it changes nothing in the clouds, it changes you in the straw. You drift, grateful for bread that holds together and neighbors who do the same, and you think, not for the first time, that survival is a recipe more than a miracle. Banners bloom like hard flowers above spears, and the town's shoulders rise as one. Harness jingles, horse sweat and tar bite the air. A column in mixed colors slides through the gate like a river that decided to wear boots. You tell yourself they are here to keep the peace. You also count the sacks in your barn twice, because protection and procurement look suspiciously alike when a captain carries a list that reads like your pantry. Soldiers eat time first. A table appears in the square with a clerk, a chest, and the calm of people who have practiced disappointment. The word they prefer is purveyance, a crown's right to take supplies for fair payment. And the phrase you actually hear is, "We'll settle accounts later." Timber, salt meat, grain, and cart space grow patriotic in a hurry. You sign a tally and tuck it into your shirt as if paper could be stew. A mainstream fact walks beside you. Medieval kings routinely requisition carts and food in wartime, and later can be a very elastic afternoon. Every army brings its own weather. Smiths, laundresses, sutlers with reassuring barrels, and boys carrying arrows in baskets like very serious fruit ripple behind the spear points. You move tools from shed to loft. You stop locking the front door and start locking the granary, which feels rude and practical at once. A horse drains a bucket as if thirst were an occupation. A drummer tries a flourish, drops a stick, and the square graciously pretends not to notice. Small mercies keep tempers cool. By dusk, a sergeant measures your street with his eyes. He speaks pleasantly about billeting, the art of turning 12 beds into 20, and you stand in the doorway calculating which blankets can survive a night near unfamiliar boots. The men assigned to your threshold are not monsters, which is almost disappointing given the stories. One snores like a saw. One weeps for a wife who breeds geese with terrifying success. One is incurably curious about your pie recipe. You hide the good spice and loan them your plainest jokes, which they actually enjoy. Rumor starts at once. The Lord's levy, someone says, will demand men with bills and bows by the next new moon. Someone else says coin will do instead. The neat word for turning duty into arithmetic is scutage. You look at your hands and wonder whether they are better at a bowstring or a broom. Historians still argue whether common levies formed the backbone of most medieval hosts or whether paid men-at-arms and hired companies carried the real weight, and your broom leans toward the second answer. On the green, a hedge of pikes bristles toward a sky that pretends not to notice. A captain explains that what matters is keeping formation, which sounds like church advice until you see how a line of disciplined feet can push a thought across a field. The quirky thing you collect is a small oaken token, a stamped roundel a sutler sells as a promise of a pint later. Soldiers hoard them like charms and argue about which tavern honors them honestly, which is bravely optimistic for people who carry swords. Then come the men without banners. Mercenaries drift like weather fronts between employers, routiers in one decade, free companies in another, selling aid to towns that can afford it and selling fear to those that cannot. They offer letters of protection with neat wax seals and prices that adjust to your panic. You have seen a captain politely threaten to visit a place he has no quarrel with, then politely accept a fee not to. The math has its own logic. Cheaper than a siege, uglier than peace. War moves in wide gestures that land close. Along the marches, scouts burn haystacks and cut bridges so an enemy must walk farther carrying heavier worries. In the long quarrels across the channel, fast-riding chevauchee raids pull wealth into smoke and tempt proud lords onto ground not of their choosing. That is the high strategy. The low reality is a farm without a fence and a kitchen without a lid. A mainstream truth trudges by in muddy boots. Armies often lived off land they did not own when supply trains lagged. Night brings songs in 3 keys: bravado, homesickness, boredom. You sit by the hearth pretending to mend while strangers in your bed closet try to remember a prayer. One asks about the miller's daughter with a grin meant to be charming. You reply with a look that translates as she can outshoot you and lift a sack besides, which earns a laugh and a sudden respect for the miller. Another trades a story for a slice of bread, a siege where defenders flung beehives over the wall and learned to run immediately. Theft becomes a philosophy debate you never wanted. If a soldier takes a chicken from a yard in a garrison town, is that pay, convenience, or crime with a drumbeat? Your answer depends heavily on whether it was your chicken. The sheriff mutters about discipline and the captain mutters about logistics, and you stand between them like a fence post thinking about feathers. First rule of uneasy times: hide small valuables in boring containers. A purse in a basket gets stolen. A purse in a flour jar makes thieves suspicious of baking, which is victory enough. Supply trains stumble and lurch. Carts break axles at the ford. A bridge argues with a wheel until both give up. When wagons fall behind, foraging parties sprout like thistles, each convinced the nearest orchard exists to spare them a march. You cannot defend the horizon with 3 neighbors and a pitchfork, but you can point the wrong way with cheerful confidence, which you do twice and consider a public service. When they finally leave, you bless gates you can bar and friends who listen for your knock. Some afternoons the pageantry nearly wins you over. Cavalry trotting against a sunset is simply handsome. Armor gleams. Trumpets lie to the heart in a way that feels generous. But you measure truth in scuffed thresholds and thinner shelves. When the column swings away, the lane looks both wider and poorer. You count tools again and find everything where you hid it, which feels like victory. You sweep, open windows, and let the house exhale. The dust that rises looks like the end of a sentence you did not start. By week's end, talk turns to rebuilding the footbridge and reclaiming carts. Someone announces a parish muster for ditch work, which is not glamorous and therefore beloved. You help raise a new gate bar from a fallen oak and wedge it into its cradle with a team effort that produces splinters and pride. Historians still argue whether garrisons truly reduced banditry or merely pushed it into the next valley, and you decide the answer is yes, depending on which valley you are trying to sleep in tonight. You know now that soldiers bring danger and a bent kind of safety, that mercenaries sell both edges of the same blade, and that your best defense lives in careful hiding places and louder friendships. You sleep with the new gate bar in your mind like heavy punctuation. Tomorrow there will be talk of tolls and whose ox was truly taken. Tonight there is the soft noise of your own house remembering itself, and that is enough for sleep. You keep your coins in a leather purse that clicks like rain on a low roof, and lately the weather in that purse is mostly clouds. Work fills your days, your palms can testify. Yet the list of dues circles the house like cautious crows. Here, debt is never abstract. It has a polite knock, a wax seal, a clerk with tidy script, and a face that asks what you will sell first: pride, time, or the good goat. You start with the oldest claim. The tithe does not bargain much. 1/10 of grain, 1/10 of lambs, 1/10 of honey or flax, carried to the tithe barn under the same sky that watched you plant them. You remind yourself that roofs and altars do not mend themselves, and that the poor deserve bread as well as blessing. Some parishes are kinder than others. A priest with a feel for seasons will take a sheaf now and a measure later. But the rule stands like a church wall. Church wardens count plainly, and the ledger smiles only when the pile looks honest. You make a joke about donating your complaints as a separate 10th. The steward is unimpressed, but the neighbor laughs, and that helps the carrying. Then there is rent, the steady drum hidden inside every month. Some pay in coin, some in kind, some with backs and hands. The word that curls in your ear is boon work. A day given to plow the Lord's domain or haul timber to his yard. A day in sun can feel companionable, a week in sleet, less so. When a father dies, Harriet claims the best beast, so the holding passes clean. You lead the animal forward and pretend the law did not just walk through your byre with muddy boots. The stable feels larger than it did yesterday, and you do not enjoy the echo. Names of dues march past like a troop in mismatched shoes. Tallage, aid, relief, scutage, bridge penny, market penny, mill fee. You learn their choreography. Carry exact change so the weighman does not grow creative while hunting coins. Cross the bridge at dawn when the keeper likes stories and sometimes forgets to count. Grind at the Lord's mill even if your quern would do, because the fine for private grinding costs more than your temper. You tell yourself that rules keep peace, then mutter to the geese that peace is an expensive hobby. Town life teaches you to read debt in wood. A tally stick splits one branch into two truths, notches cut for the sum. Then the stick is halved so debtor and creditor hold matching teeth. When the halves meet, the account is whole. It is plain and oddly beautiful. Arithmetic you can warm by the fire. The trail of that custom wanders far. Centuries later, when clerks finally burned heaps of old tallies in a London furnace, the flames raced so eagerly up the flues that Parliament itself caught fire. You smile at the thought that even mathematics can be a little too hot. When coin thins, you visit lenders with hands like counting frames. The church frowns at usury, then quietly debates the definition while the market invents workarounds. A rent charge with a wink can look suspiciously like interest in disguise. In some quarters, Lombard bankers sit under signs of 3 golden balls. In some towns, Jewish financiers keep ledgers with alarming neatness and very clear terms. You borrow only what you can carry in your mind at night, because sleep is dearer than silver, and mortgage sounds exactly like what it is in Old French, a dead pledge. You would rather keep your promises breathing. You try not to live on the edge of a promise. A missed rent means a conversation with a bailiff who has the compassion of a fence post. Tools can be pawned, but tools are also your tomorrow, and selling tomorrow is the costliest coin. Some households bind themselves to a larger one for a season, trading independence for supper and steady work. It is not shameful. It is arithmetic with stew. You keep an eye out for ditching, carting, thatching, any job that turns time into bread with minimal complaint. And you whisper to your boots that the pay is small, but the soup is generous. Not all dues are grim. The guild wants pennies and gives back pride, training, and a wall to lean on when the wind is rude. On feast days, the same men who count halfpence like misers will throw a communal pot so generous that the town eats until even the grumbling look surprised. You carry your apprentice token and remember the first time you signed your mark in the guild book without smudging. The house laughed with you for a week and has been slightly kinder to your inkwell ever since. Still, the calendar has its ambushes. Merchet. They call a marriage payment in some places, a fee when a daughter leaves the manor's orbit. No one likes the sound of it. Some say it buys permission. Others say it is an exit toll that keeps the rolls tidy. Historians still argue whether Merchet truly measured a father's control over a daughter's choice, or mostly marked a shift in labor duty on the manor's books. You do the obvious thing and save discreetly in a jar with a false bottom and a very honest cat. There are tactics that feel like magic because they work. Pay early when you can. Late fees are the only poetry a bailiff appreciates. Keep your half of the tally safe from damp so the notches do not blur into accusations. Store grain for the hunger gap between old and new harvests so you are not bargaining with a shaking hand. Teach the children numbers by the shape of dues, so they learn to be brave without being reckless. When a neighbor needs seed, lend it and ask for help at shearing, not coin, because wool answers winter better than promises do. A mainstream fact steadies you like a fence post. The tithe is a tenth by long custom, and rents repeat even when you do not. What changes is capacity. Good years fit like a well-sewn coat. Bad years wear you instead. In thin times you look for fair-dealing officials and write their names in your memory as carefully as your own. A kind reeve can change the weather of a street, and you keep a quiet list of the people who make rules humane. Now and then, mercy puts on boots. The Lord remits a fee after blight, because empty cottages pay nothing. The parish opens the tithe barn in a hard Lent, because charity raised it as much as timber did. A clerk makes a mistake in your favor, and you do not correct him loudly, because prudence whispers. You sleep better on those nights, and suspect the rafters approve. By lamplight you sort the week into 3 piles. Do now, do soon, do when Providence blinks. You seal a small pledge and promise yourself not to touch the jar without a witness, which means you are inviting a friend to tea as well as honesty. The flame steadies, your pulse steadies. Debts are part of the grammar here, but so is the sentence that follows. Paid, forgiven, shared. You practice that line until it feels sturdy enough to carry upstairs. Lay your purse beside the bed like a small, tired animal, and tell it very kindly to stop biting. You wake to tools the way some people wake to birdsong. The sickle leans in the doorway like a quiet uncle with sharp opinions. The flail waits by the granary, 2 sticks joined by a cord that has ended more arguments than any sermon. Out in the field, the grass beads with dawn, and you remember the first rule they drum into every apprentice. Keep your eyes where the edge is. It is obvious until the day is long. The mind wanders, and the edge reminds you it does not take naps. The field's hazards wear honest faces. A scythe can make poetry out of wheat and misery out of thumbs in a single breath. You fall into the rhythm, long swings and careful steps, the blade whispering just above the earth. The safest cutters are the ones who work like they are humming a lullaby, not chasing a rabbit. You learn the habit of placing your free hand behind your back when you stoop. It looks theatrical and saves skin. You tie rag strips on the haft where your grip wants to slide when sweat grows chatty. A wry truth of harvest work is that caution looks slow until you count how quickly a bandage slows everything else. Threshing is its own small storm. The flail comes down, the sheaves crackle, and the air fills with chaff that thinks your eyes are inns with vacant rooms. You wet a cloth and tie it over nose and mouth, not as a grand gesture but as a truce with dust. The barn floor becomes a compass rose of footprints and husk. Children bring buckets and practice the old art of being helpful by staying out of the arc of the swinging stick. Even in safe hands, a flail can kiss a skull with enough enthusiasm to make memory blink. So you mark your space like a polite bear and keep to it. At the mill, the tone changes from rustic to mechanical. A water wheel turns like a patient planet, wood paddles biting the stream, sluice gate singing in its hinge. Inside, the stones speak in their gritty dialect, upper to nether, grain to flour, steady and remorseless. By the 13th century, mills like this were everywhere in Northern Europe. Grinding grain and power in fulling hammers for cloth as naturally as lungs power a song. Everyone knows the miller's right to the Lord's custom. Everyone also knows why your wrist itches to hold a hand quern on days when fees feel personal. Historians still argue whether compulsory milling was enforced with iron consistency or winked at in quiet kitchens where querns hummed softly out of earshot. You respect the mill the way sailors respect the sea. Loose sleeves can become brief tragedies. Hair can turn into an urgent lesson in knots. You watch the gears with their pegged teeth, ox blood staining the well-dressed stone from its last dressing. The quirky thing no one admits liking. The miller tests flour between finger and thumb so often that people say his thumb grows broad and clever, a badge that shows up in proverbs and jokes. You buy your sack, pretend not to notice the extra ounce that might be inside or outside your favor, and keep your smile in the polite range. The forge is thunder with a roof. Heat crawls into your shirt and makes old scars wake up like veterans swapping stories. The smith's arm finds a beat with the bellows. The anvil answers with a voice like iron bells trying to sing. You hold a bar with tongs while the smith draws it out, and you learn to read red. Cherry for drawing, orange for bending, yellow for punching. The quench hisses like snakes in a bath. A mainstream truth rings from every colonnade of tools. Ironwork holds towns together, from hinge to hoop to horseshoe. And a day without the smith is a day when doors sulk and carts refuse their manners. Safety here is choreography, not luck. You stand a half step back from the striking plane. You announce every pass and lift so the smith knows which way the heat is traveling. You keep the floor clean because loose scale is as treacherous as spilled peas on stone. Somewhere a young apprentice tries to catch a falling tool and learns the oldest rule the hard way. Let iron meet the ground. It cannot be embarrassed, but you can. When the iron wants tempering, the smith quenches in water for one tool and in oil for another. And someone always tells the tale of quenching in stale urine for a springy edge, a practice that proves both chemistry and comedy live in the same bucket. Workshops keep their own saints. In the weaver's hall, warp weights swing like sleepy bees and looms click with a patience that hides sore backs. In the fuller's shed, hammers lift and fall in pairs, pounding lanolin out of cloth until it behaves. Tanners stir hides in pits where the smell negotiates with your appetite and wins. The cobbler's awl glints, at once humble and sovereign. Every craft has a way to bite, and every master has a litany of precautions that sound like nagging until you watch them save a finger. The guild is both fence and hearth. Years of apprenticeship teach your hands the geometry of safe motions. Teach your feet where not to stand. Teach your mouth the habit of warning before reaching. A master can spot danger 3 heartbeats before it speaks, and 6 behind if he is telling a good story. You love the shop gossip that doubles as training. Last winter in the next town, a water wheel froze, then broke free and hurled a plank through a window, surprising a cat into sainthood. You laugh, then check your own sluice pins just in case sainthood is contagious. Mine work is a darker arithmetic. You have not worked a deep pit yourself, but you have shared ale with men whose faces carry the same map as a forge wall. They talk of timbering the galleries while listening for the slow, expensive language of rock. Flooding is patient. Gas is impatient. Both want to be the last thing you meet. A miner opens his mouth to describe a cave-in and then closes it again, shrugging in a way that says there is a contract between men and stone, handwritten and rarely honored. You pour him another and let the silence sit. Mills, forges, barns, pits. They are all engines in a world without guards and warning signs. You learn to make your own guards out of habit. Hang tools where hands know to find them without looking. Keep a bucket where flame might get ambitious. Tie sleeves near the wrist in any room with spinning parts. The small rules feel fussy until you picture the day without them. The best joke you hear all week is a master telling a boy that accidents love applause, so never clap when you are proud. Just nod like a sensible otter and move your feet away from the edge. The body is your first tool and last refuge, so you treat it that way. Wrap the cut, splint the break. Keep a salve of lard and plantain where shoes rub. The midwife who knows babies also knows bones. The priest who knows prayers knows where the burial plots begin, and that knowledge quiets shortcuts better than any bill posted on a door. A fact walks with you to bed. The busiest hands are the most scarred, and the most careful hands are the hands still working after feast day. You count your fingers, count your blessings, and decide to do the same tomorrow. Evening folds around the forge like a cloak drying on a chair. The mill slows to a gentle mutter, the field darkens, and the flail hangs from its peg like a tired drummer. You bank the fire with the tenderness of a truce. The day ends not with drama, but with a list. Edges oiled, stones checked, sleeves mended. You whisper to the tools that you will be boring again tomorrow, which is another way to say alive. Somewhere in all that carefulness, sleep finds you, and when it does, it arrives with both hands. The sky owns the calendar long before any lord does. This morning it writes in gray ink, long strokes of rain that turn the lane to a patient mirror, and the fields to arguments with boots. You watch the drops bead along the lintel and think like a farmer even when you are not one. Too much, too late, too cold. The barley looks offended, the rye looks resigned, and the beans practice floating like tiny philosophers. You tuck your cloak tighter and tell yourself water is good in the right places, which is also what you say about gossip and geese. You measure seasons by chores. Plowing wants a firm crust, sowing wants a welcoming bed, harvest wants a dry laugh in the stalks. Instead, the rain rehearses all the parts. Cartwheels chew soup. The Ford sulks. A mule considers theology in the middle of a puddle and refuses to move. You help your neighbor lift a stuck axle and together you swear the kind of elegant, creative oath that would make a priest retire early. Somewhere upstream, the miller opens his sluice wide because swollen rivers carry stones like gossip carries names, and nobody wants a broken wheel before Lammas. Cold has its own handwriting. A late frost sneaks in after smiles have already been exchanged with the orchard, takes a breath, and writes no across the blossom. You step out at dawn, and the trees look powdered with sugar, which would be charming if it were cake. The next wind scatters those white confetti like the end of a party no one enjoyed. People pretend to shrug, then count jars. You store more pottage and fewer promises. Honey helps because bees read weather better than any clerk, and if they bring back little, you learn to plan like a bee, quietly, with backups. The older men talk about years when rain began in spring and forgot to stop. They speak of 1315 to 1317 as if the date itself were a damp blanket, of hay that rotted before it dried, of grain that sprouted in the sheaf, of crows who grew cheeky and men who grew thin. A mainstream truth steadies the tale. The Great Famine spread across much of northern Europe when relentless rains and cold crowded fields and barns into failure. Wagons bogged down, prices climbed in boots, and the hunger gap widened into a season you could fall into. You file the memory as a cautionary tale with muddy edges. Every town invents weather wisdom because it must. You sniff the wind for salt or peat. You keep St. Swithin's Day in the back of your mind, half in jest. Rain then, rain for weeks, says the proverb, and nobody wants to see if it is auditioning for honesty. Candlemas arrives and people whisper, if the day is bright, winter bites twice. If it is dim, winter gives up. You check the sky and brew either celebration or surrender accordingly. The quirky charm in your lane is a cabbage leaf nailed to the door to predict rain by how it curls. It works just often enough to make dignified people look at it. You approve. Fields answer to the slow logic of rotation. The common strips lie open to a dance you could mark on a church wall. Wheat here, then spring grain there, then a rest in fallow where livestock wanders and pays rent in patience and dung. You walk the bounds in rogation week with the parish, beating the landmarks with switches and hymns, asking for fair weather and fair yield. It is half prayer, half crowdsourced map maintenance. Historians still argue whether processions, fasts, and field blessings truly shifted outcomes or mainly soothed communities that already faced the math of soil and sky. You go anyway because walking together steadies the knees. Wet years teach you new flavors of ruin. Flour clumps and sulks. Loaves bake heavy and keep secrets. Rye, if pushed too long and damp, invites a sly guest. Ergot, a fungus with a taste for mischief. People tell stories of burning limbs and strange visions that some call a saint's fire, and others call a cruel joke of nature. You do the practical thing and nudge the steward toward cleaner storage and better winnowing, because whatever the argument's name is, hunger and poison both argue too loudly. On drier years you try not to gloat. The field remembers. You should too. Cold years bring another kind of lesson. A bright, brittle morning can make a bucket chime, and you learn to stack firewood with the geometry of a fortress. Wool layers become diplomacy between skin and air. You check the buyer at night, breath fogging as you lean your forehead against a cow's flank for warmth and kindness that runs both ways. A fact sits by the door with your boots. The climate leans and sway over generations, and what your grandparents called normal might be a shade different from your children's normal. Historians still argue whether the cooler pulse often called the Little Ice Age began this early or gathered later, a debate that changes how we read frost lines in old stories. Wind is the big uninvited guest. A gale finds every imperfection in thatch, every loose shutter pin, every honest intention you forgot to tie down. You learn the sailor's habit of thinking ahead on land. Stack carts leeward of walls. Angle ladders so they do not turn into jokes. Tie the oven door even when you plan to be brave. Afterward, the town looks combed backward. But the comb is in your hand, and you can start again. You check the beehives, greet the survivors like nobles, and pour a little ale on the doorstep for luck, because luck is cheap, and politeness is cheaper. Rain writes travel restrictions no sheriff can argue with. Markets move outside the walls where mud can swallow the day whole. Pack animals splay their legs and reconsider their career choices. You plan routes by crown of road and kindness of hedgerow. There is wit in using ridges that keep your boots honest and fords that do not turn a cart into an imitation of a boat. Your best joke of the week is that the only thing waterproof is gossip. It crosses rivers without getting its hem wet. When skies behave, you don't celebrate loudly. You simply become efficient. In a run of fair days, the town turns into a hive with manners. Scythes shine, kilns breathe, fish dry on racks like silver commas, and shutters stand open to brag on clean floors. The mill sings in a comfortable tenor, and the Fords blink tolerantly at wheel splash. You make hay with shameless speed because you remember the alternative, and memory is the best weather vane you own. By evening, the clouds consider mercy. You set a pot to catch roof drips and lay a plank over the worst puddle. Then sit on the threshold and watch the lane think about becoming a stream and then change its mind. Your cloak steams. Your bones thank you. You speak to the sky in the same tone you use with a stubborn friend. I hear you. I respect you. And I will see you in the morning. The rain slows as if embarrassed by its own enthusiasm, and you sleep with your ear tuned to the roof, counting the spaces between drops like someone measuring hope with a spoon. The bucket comes up from the well with a hopeful slosh and a suspicious sparkle. You tilt it to the light, and the surface frowns back at you, a tiny galaxy of flecks that refuse to choose between dust and dinner. You have learned to be courteous with water and ruthless with doubt. A settle of patience works wonders, a boil does more, and a brew does most of all. That is the quiet arithmetic of your street. When in doubt, make ale. It is not bravado so much as plumbing disguised as conviviality. You carry the bucket home with the care you reserve for sleeping babies and fresh ink. In the lane, a gutter dreams of being a river and nearly succeeds. The town tries to wrangle its wastes with rules posted like polite threats. No tossing offal before dawn, no muck heaps at the pump. No tannery runoff anywhere near the market unless you enjoy fines and public scolding. The rules help, though they share a weakness with every rule since time began. They need people who are not in a hurry. Inside, you pour the water through cloth that started life as a decent shirt and now has a second career. Barrels line the wall like quiet jurors. The best ones you keep for ale, because boiling the mash and letting yeast take command turns risky water into a drink that argues with boredom rather than your insides. A mainstream fact sits in your kitchen and refuses to leave. For long stretches of medieval life, small beer and ale are everyday drinks for children and adults alike. Not because people dislike water, but because they like waking up tomorrow. You rinse the cups and laugh at your own fussiness. Somewhere a neighbor mutters that you are the kind of person who would strain sunlight if you could. It is not untrue. Across the yard, the privy keeps its counsel, which is fortunate. Placement matters. Too close to the well and tomorrow's soup becomes a sermon. Too far and winter becomes an endurance sport. You throw ash in the pit because ash is a friend to smells and to dignity, and both deserve encouragement. Vermin, meanwhile, do not read rules. Rats move like rumors along rafters, clever and patient. Mice invent tiny doors where carpenters swore there were none yesterday. Fleas hold family reunions in the seams of blankets. Lice keep office hours under hats. You learn the choreography of resistance. Hang sacks. Raise bins. Let the cat practice night music and applaud generously. Boil linens on the green when the sun makes a rare generous promise. Comb children with the seriousness usually reserved for legal documents. Itching becomes a background instrument, a faint fiddle behind every song. You keep a small tin of lard and herbs that smells like ambition and relief. You trade recipes in whispers. Pennyroyal in wash water. A dab of vinegar behind the ears for bravado. Laurel leaves in chests to make moths doubt themselves. The quirky trick your aunt swears by is sprinkling juniper on the hearth before sweeping, so the smell persuades insects to seek other addresses. You do it because it smells like a walk in good weather. The town's water stories are both cautionary and loyal. Wells have personalities, and you know each by rope creak and bucket note. One tastes of iron and stubbornness. Another tastes of old stone and rain that remembers clouds fondly. A new well opens near the smithy, and the whole street debates its virtue as if it were a neighbor. Historians still argue whether urban water supplies were generally worse than rural ones, or whether careful siting, covered conduits, and diligent wardens often made town water decent for its day. Your tongue casts the deciding vote each morning, and it is a strict judge. On washing days, the green looks like a festival of surrender. Sheets snap, shirts posture, breeches contemplate philosophy. Boiling pots breathe like patient dragons. You beat rugs and pretend you are punishing them for old impertinences. Children run through steaming clouds until someone remembers that wet cloth has opinions about mud. The best part is the sound. A clean slap of fabric on wood that feels like progress in a world that often prefers circles. You brew because brew is what sense tastes like. Malted grain meets heat, water wakes sugars, yeast walks in as if invited, and suddenly a household has morale by the cup. You keep it gentle because you are not trying to start a brawl at supper. A small beer at breakfast makes the tongue friendly and the stomach calm. The husk and yeast cake you save for the pigs, who respect your craftsmanship with a sincerity rarely seen in people. You smile at the elegant logic of it all. The brewery, the buyer, the bread oven, and the well-holed hands behind the scenes like a quartet that agrees on the key at last. Sometimes the gutter wins. A storm rips through and pulls half the street's dirt into the drain like a magician who has grown overconfident. The grates sneeze, clog, and suddenly water looks for a doorbell. You and your neighbors take up shovels and become civil engineers with muddy shoes. A channel cut here, a sandbag there, a rude joke about whose yard deserves a temporary pond, and the flood de-escalates into a sulk. The town exhales and pretends it never panicked. You store the sandbags where you can trip over them on a fine day, so you will remember they exist on a bad one. Parasites are the quiet diplomats of misery. Roundworms file paperwork in bellies that have never signed anything. Tapeworms compose long, boring letters. You fight them with heat, with time, with a stubborn refusal to be sloppy. You trim meat like a sculptor who prefers safety to bravado. You cook long enough to insult any self-respecting worm. When the gossip mentions a neighbor's child with a belly like a drum, you bring broth, bread, and advice, and you do not say "I told you so," even if you told them so twice. The town has inspectors with unexpected flair. A scavenger walks the streets before dawn with a cart and a sense of purpose, collecting what should not remain. A raker mines the gutters like a hard-working river spirit. The night soil man moves quietly and is spoken of with the kind of grateful discretion usually reserved for people who bring news from far wars. Their work is unglamorous and essential, and when the wind is right, you thank them with sincerity that makes eyes water. Not every tale is grim. There was the afternoon a barrel staved in, and the ale ran down the lane in a thin parade. Children chased it with cups, as if they could catch a holiday by the handle, and you clapped like a kindly villain before helping the cooper curse in a helpful tone. There was the day the cat emerged from the granary with a rat so large it needed an introduction. A victory that earned the cat a name and a chair near the hearth like a retired admiral. The house applauds competence wherever it finds it. A fact you keep by the door like a broom. Cleanliness is not a fashion here, it is strategy. Rinse, boil, brew, sweep, raise, hang, cover. None of it is grand. All of it is cumulative. You have no microscope, but you have outcomes, and outcomes talk plainly. A tidy lane gets sick less often. A guarded well gossips less in the wrong direction. A household that treats itch as a signal instead of a destiny sleeps better. By night you touch the bucket by habit. A small reassurance that tomorrow begins where you expect it. The gutters settle into their nocturne. A trickle that sounds like someone telling a calming story just outside the door. You bank the hearth and set a pot to warm for morning. The itch on your wrist fades, the cat purrs, and the barrel hoops creak as wood breathes in the cool. The town rests on 1,000 tiny correctives, none heroic on their own, all formidable together. You smile in the dark, because you have quietly mastered one of the medieval arts that matters most. You made water behave. The room glows like a small chapel made of breath. One candle flares, another gutters, and the rushes on the floor hold their own counsel. You move softly because tonight the house is a ship, and the woman on the bed is steering it through a narrow strait. The midwife arrives without fuss, smelling of soap and rosemary, hands scrubbed, sleeves tied, voice low enough to calm a cat. She knows this house. She knows your stove, your buckets, your habit of stashing clean cloths near the oven because warm linen feels like courage. She nods, and the whole room exhales as if permission has been granted to hope. You heat water because everyone always heats water, and no one argues with tradition when the night leans forward. The birthing stool is fetched from a neighbor. An honest three-legged thing with a crescent cut in the seat to make gravity an ally. The midwife checks the cord ties, the swaddling strips, the clean shift, the knife to cut the cord, the wisp of wool for a diaper, the honey for the first sticky mouth. She speaks to the mother as if they are shelling peas together. When the pain comes, you count with her until numbers feel like rope you can pull on with both hands. The house keeps rules you barely notice on ordinary days. Windows unlatched, doors unbarred, knots untied. Someone has quietly loosened every ribbon and strap, because old wisdom says tight things hold in pain. You smile because superstition and empathy are cousins, and tonight you are happy to invite the whole family. A small pot of ale caudle steams on the trivet, spiced with ginger and a bit of egg. Strength in a cup that tastes like good news. Between waves, the mother takes tiny sips and laughs once when a baby kick surprises her rib. A friendly knock from someone impatient to be introduced. A mainstream fact gives shape to your carefulness. Childbirth is a main road of risk for women in these centuries, and the small lives arriving meet their own steep hill in the first days. Baptism happens quickly for a reason, often within hours, a blessing and a hedge against the worst. You have seen a priest come at dawn with oil and a voice still thick with sleep, stepping around a cat and a bucket without breaking the solemnity. You have also seen a neighbor pour water over a blue-lipped infant's head when the world decided to be cruel before a bell could be rung. No one lectures on theology afterwards. Everyone just breathes. The midwife hums a tune that keeps time better than any hourglass. Between pains, she rubs the mother's back with oil and praise. During pains, she becomes a wall that sways exactly the right way. You admire the choreography, the way hands and words travel together. She checks position with such gentleness that you forget the check is work. She listens with her fingers. When something needs changing, she asks for a different stool angle, a new cloth, a little more heat, less heat, quiet, anything that turns chance into craft. You hand things over like a squire at a quiet battle. Old charms walk the edges of the room like shy guests. A birth girdle, worn smooth with prayers, lies folded on a chest. Someone has set a candle blessed at Candlemas on the mantel for luck. Under the bed, because families are gloriously practical, a flat loaf and a small iron blade wait to be placed in the cradle to keep away envy and drafts. The quirky custom you always remember is the caul. If a baby is born veiled, the skin is carefully dried and kept as a lucky token. Sailors will pay for it, certain it wards off drowning. You raise an eyebrow at that and tuck the thought away with other good stories. Difficult births teach a new grammar of silence. The midwife's voice goes slower. The women at the bedside glance at one another in sentences made of breath. A cousin takes up a psalm that has plenty of room for improvisation. Sometimes there is a long pause and a longer push, and then the world answers with a wet shout that makes lies of time. Sometimes the pause holds. In those hours you understand the precise weight of bravery. Historians still argue whether midwives worked under consistent licensing and church oversight, or whether informal networks and local oaths carried most authority, but no one in this room needs a stamp to measure skill. When it goes well, it goes from storm to dawn in a breath. The babe slides into hands ready to welcome. The room becomes busy in the softest way, and everyone finds a job that feels like gratitude wearing an apron. You see the cord tied with 2 practiced knots, the blade cleaned in flame for a heartbeat, the cry that starts like a squeak and grows into a thesis. The mother blinks as if someone set down a moon in her lap. You wrap the small body in linen, careful but not too tight, because swaddling should be snug like a hug and not an argument with arms. You warm a spoon of honey or butter for the first taste depending on whose aunt is in charge of tradition today. Afterwards is its own terrain. You brew pennyroyal only to freshen the air because you have learned to be cautious with herbs that are too clever. And you bring in a cup of warm ale thinned with milk like the midwife prefers. The bed is remade with dry sheets that smell faintly of the yard and sun. Someone whispers about burying the placenta beneath a threshold or near a fruit tree so the child will always find home or sweetness. The yard already holds 3 such secret graves. It comforts you that the ground remembers family even better than ledgers do. The next days become a ceremony of small carefulnesses. Lying in keeps the mother wrapped in warmth and quiet while neighbors ferry broth and confidence. Clean hands become an article of faith. You wash linens more often than you thought possible, and discover that boiling water is a friend with excellent manners. A fact you keep like a talisman is simple. Childbed fever can visit when cleanliness falters, though people here give it other names. Later ages will name the culprit with lenses and lament. You just keep water hot and fabric changing and wonder why that helps so reliably. Soon comes the walk to church for Thanksgiving, the churching that brings blessing and a quick return to company. The baby earns names and a place at the table's stories. A godparent jokes about training a champion sleeper because that is a gift everyone will appreciate. The house learns new soundtracks. Lamb soft sighs, small hiccups, inconvenient triumphs. You learn to stir a pot with one hand and regain a dropped blanket with a foot. You also learn the art of a nap so deep it could serve as a sermon. When it goes badly, the house still performs its duties. Voices soften as if the walls are listening and need gentleness too. Neighbors come with bread and presents. The midwife stays until the room is tidy in a way that suggests love rather than absence, and she leaves a hand on your shoulder long enough to say what words cannot. The parish makes space. The town tucks the loss into its memory, not to forget it, but to carry it without dropping other things. The road outside keeps moving because it must. Inside, you sit with a cup and the shape of silence that follows brave knights. Tonight, though, the candle reassures. The mother sleeps with the slackness that means safety. The baby whistles like a kettle that refuses to boil. You stand at the door and feel the house grow wider by exactly the size of one new heartbeat. You bank the fire and set a bowl where it will be found at first light. You grin at the ridiculousness of being thrilled by a burp. It is a good ridiculousness. It is what victory looks like when it is small and breathing. Market day begins with apples, ends with opinions, and somewhere in the middle the law sets up a folding table. You can feel it shift when the bell changes tone and the crowd's chatter flattens. A clerk unrolls a list. The bailiff clears his throat with the ambition of a small thunderstorm. Bodies edge into a half circle, because justice prefers witnesses the way bread prefers heat. You stand where you can see both the scales and the pillory, the two favorite teaching aids of a town that believes in quick lessons. The first business is ordinary and relentless: measures. The iron weights come out like saints with names: pound, ounce, yard, and the ale measure gets a hard stare. A brewer blushes as his quart turns out to be 2 sips short of respectability. He pays a fine and pays again in story. Because everyone will tell this tale at supper. A mainstream fact anchors the show. Across the realm, regulations like the assize of bread and ale tie prices and measures to common standards, so a short pint or a light loaf invites punishment in public. That punishment lives 10 steps away. The pillory, a timber with opinions. A boy asks what it feels like to be locked in the pillory. You resist the urge to say breezy. It is not. It is bright, humiliating, and educational for everyone else. Rotten greens fly with the accuracy born of practice, and the culprit learns to keep his mouth closed in every sense. For the woman who scolds neighbors to charcoal, there is a cucking stool by the mill pond, a dunking seat on a long beam, reserved for common brawlers and fraudulent alewives according to the town gossip, which is the most precise record office you know. The quirky tale that never dies says a cheating baker must parade through the market with his light loaf hung around his neck. Another town prefers to tie the bad bread to the pillory and let flies hand down their verdict. Not all reckonings are comic. A thief stands before the sheriff, thin and stubborn as a strap. Witnesses speak, some eager, some careful. A jury of neighbors, men who know both the accused and the price of a sheep, murmur over facts like merchants over wool. You can feel the centuries shifting under your feet. Earlier ages leaned on ordeals of hot iron or cold water, but after the church banned clerical involvement in 1215, those trials lost their halo, and juries grew into the space, turning knowledge of a man's habits into evidence that could free or snare him. Historians still argue whether juries mostly protected ordinary people from harsh laws or mostly protected towns from troublesome neighbors. The answer here depends suspiciously on whether the troublesome neighbor is also your cousin. Punishments speak the language of spectacle. Fines are quiet. The stocks are not. A branding iron hisses in a brazier like a blunt warning no one wants to hear twice. The sheriff prefers to keep hangings outside the walls if he can, because death draws crowds that spend nothing at market. You have seen the scaffold once and decided once is a fine number. Outlawry, the sentence that turns a person into a problem for any hedge to solve, is pronounced with a spare dignity that makes your spine cool. A man who refuses to attend court when summoned can be declared outside the king's peace, and then every road is a wager with long odds. Sanctuary sits in the background like a church door that knows its job. If a desperate soul reaches the nave and grips the ring, the town performs an old ritual of mercy with rules sharper than they look. He can confess, abjure, and take the king's highway to a port, barefoot with a cross on his shoulder, promising never to return. It is safety with a price tag the size of a country. The other loophole has a nickname. Benefit of clergy allows a literate offender to claim church jurisdiction, once upon a time by reading a verse from memory. Your friend calls Psalm 51 the neck verse and swears it has saved more throats than doctors. You suspect exaggeration, but you also practice your letters with renewed zeal. Order begins earlier than trumpets. The town watches itself through the frank pledge system, tithings of neighbors bound to produce an accused man or carry the stain of his absence together. If someone yells hue and cry, you run, not because you love exercise, but because failing to help can draw a fine. You prefer your fines to come from poor jokes, not poor citizenship. The watch walks at night with staff and lantern, and your doorbar counts as a cooperative witness. You picture law as a set of woven cords: parish, guild, tithing, court, strongest when no single strand pretends to do all the work. The strangest cases make the best bench gossip. You remember a story from a market 2 days' ride away where an animal, yes, an actual pig, was tried for killing a child and hanged in a square with terrible seriousness. It sounds like satire wearing a mask, yet the records say such trials happened now and then. People need cause and effect to shake hands, even clumsily. When fear runs out of humans, it deputizes pigs. You prefer your pigs salted and your justice pointed elsewhere, but the tail refuses to retire. Still, this market's rhythm is mostly practical. The reeve reads the amercements, a kind of variable fine, like a litany. A woman pays for selling fish on a fast day with the sort of cheerful defiance that suggests she will do it again. A tanner pays for rinsing hides in the wrong ditch and promises to move his stink farther from saints and vegetables. The town laughs, then nods, then remembers the stink and nods harder. A thief recites a confession so elegant you almost admire the effort, then spoils it by blaming his dog. Even the dog looks unconvinced. You keep count of lessons you can actually use. Mind your measures because the market owns memory. Close your mouth near the stocks because humor plus cabbage equals regret. Speak softly to officials and loudly to your conscience, in that order. If summoned, go. If accused, bring neighbors who remember you at your best. If you drink, drink with men who will testify that you sing on key. Your most valuable investment in this system is a reputation that can walk to the square without shoes. A fact steadies your stomach as the crowd thins. Many disputes end in fines, not blood, and more in settlements than in scaffolds. The pageantry of severity is real, but so is the arithmetic. The town prefers workers with bruised pride to martyrs with empty purses and empty chairs at supper. Historians still argue whether medieval justice was harsher than we imagine or more negotiated than we give it credit for. Watching a baker pay a fine with coin and a dozen apology buns, you suspect negotiation keeps a second ledger under the table. By late afternoon, justice packs away like a traveling show. The pillory sits lonely, the clerk blots the last name, and the square remembers it is hungry. You buy onions from the woman who teased the bailiff into lenience and bread from the man whose loaves now weigh exactly as much as pennants. You walk home with dinner and a renewed respect for quiet compliance. When the curfew bell rolls outward like a lid over the day, you lay your bundle down, touch the door bar, and promise your tongue it will be careful tomorrow. You prefer your audience in this town to be customers, not jurors. A rumor can light a room without raising the temperature. Tonight it glows along the rafters in phrases that begin with, "I heard," and end with, "May God forgive me if I'm wrong." You have learned to hear the shape of danger inside politeness. A charm on a windowsill becomes an argument about pride. A book in the wrong language becomes an invitation to curiosity that looks, from a certain angle, like defiance. You pull the shutter almost closed and leave a sliver for listening, a habit as old as the first quarrel that borrowed a halo. The lane has its experts in other people's mistakes. A midwife who keeps a pocket of dried herbs becomes a question mark. You know those herbs by smell and recipe, and none of them have horns. A widow who reads well enough to price cloth could have learned at her father's table. Yet the words scholar and stubborn are cousins in mouths that prefer obedience. A man who speaks too beautifully about poverty might be praised as devout or scolded as a lollard, depending on how the wind lifts his sentence. The friars arrive and preach with a speed that suggests someone wrote to them. Your town is now a conversation between a pulpit and a whisper. Inside, the smallest objects declare their loyalties. You keep a pilgrim badge by the door, a little pewter token from a shrine. Not because pewter protects anything, but because the sight of it calms visitors who like their piety visible. You tuck away a charm written years ago when your nephew burned with a fever, an abracadabra drawn in a tapering triangle on clean parchment because a neighbor swore it drew illness down and out. It worked, or time worked. You let them share the credit. The candle you save from Candlemas stands near the hearth because light with a blessing feels warmer than light without one. You lean towards sense and also keep a foot in hope. The mainstream fact sits on the bench like a serious guest. In the 13th century, papal inquisitors were appointed in parts of Europe to investigate heresy, especially where dissident movements took root, and their methods included preaching, questioning, and records that learned the careful art of naming names. That finds you in a careful mood when a stranger asks ordinary questions a half step too precisely. You picture a clerk with ink on his thumb and patience for long afternoons. You picture your own name rising in a list like steam. You answer with honesty and the kind of brevity that keeps soup from boiling over. You think about books because books think about you. The parish keeps a chained volume on a lectern, too valuable to wander, and you prefer it there because you can visit it like a favorite tree. A neighbor's cousin once owned a gospel in the vernacular and spoke of it with the tenderness some men reserve for hounds. When questioned, he looked down and said he loved words, which is the truest confession you have ever heard. Some nights you read by memory more than by candle, psalms shaped to your mouth by work and weather. A visiting canon once called it devotion. Another called it presumption. You keep reading, and you keep your window small. Whispers have recipes. Envy, injury, and piety in uneven measures. Stir with sleeplessness. The cow that fails at milking twice becomes a theological lecture. The bread that won't rise becomes an allegory with a finger attached to it. Everyone knows a story about a neighbor who muttered, and a chicken that died, as if poultry kept diaries for the devil. You prefer your explanations with more daylight, but you also know a fence is a fence because it keeps the garden from turning into an argument. So you nod at the charms that mean comfort to other doorways, and keep your comments in the same bucket as your spare nails. Once, in the next town, a woman was accused of ill-wishing because 2 children fell sick after she refused to lend a pot. It sounded thin even before the priest asked her what prayers she used when turning the loaves, and she answered with a list so familiar it could have been your mother's. The court fined the accuser for malice, which felt like a gust of clear air in a room that needed dusting. You went home and put your best pot on the shelf where it could be seen, not because you wanted to lend it, but because you wanted to choose when you did. People can forgive a poor stew. They never forgive a hidden ladle. Elsewhere, the stakes rise high enough to cast a shadow here. You hear travelers speak of Cathar houses broken and fires that left not sermons but smoke. Later, other travelers speak of men called lollards muttering about scripture in English and cups without gold. You hold both tales in a cautious hand because distance does not make a story lighter. Historians still argue whether village-level suspicion of magic in these late centuries was mostly neighborly quarrels dressed up as doctrine, or whether learned demonology, the idea of a grand, organized witchcraft, had already begun to trickle down through anxious sermons and elite texts. You suspect the broom flies on both winds at once. The quirky thing you cannot forget is a rite you saw once when a church excommunicated a man for violence with the ceremony people call bell, book, and candle. A bell rang, a book closed, a candle was snuffed, and even the dust seemed to freeze in place. The next week, the same man was seen leaving a loaf at the widow's door before dawn and paying back a long debt. Fear reorganizes a life quickly. You do not love fear as a tool, but you admit it can sharpen a lesson faster than a homily that naps halfway through itself. Night deepens and the talk grows softer. Someone mentions trials by water, the old ordeal where a bound body met a river to see whether innocence floats. You remind them gently that the church forbade clerical involvement in ordeals long ago, and that the new fashion is to ask neighbors, not pawns. Still, the idea drifts like a ghost across the hearth and refuses to leave entirely, because simple pictures stay even when laws change. Allegations have a way of borrowing old costumes to feel more convincing. Your own house keeps a pledge. Keep company with calm people. Keep the door open at the right hours and the mouth closed at the right moments. Borrow and lend without tallying stingily, because stinginess breeds stories. When someone comes to ask whether you have seen a charm, you show them your pilgrim badge and your worn psalm, and your very ordinary broom. You give them a cup of small beer and a seat by the fire, and talk about weather until their shoulders drop. You do not conspire. You simmer. There is mercy in procedures. In many places, an accusation without proof weighs less than a cat, and cats are heavy when you try to put them in baskets. A reeve asks for witnesses who can stand without shaking. A curate asks whether confession is truly what the visitor seeks, or whether apology would do. You have watched a village talk itself out of burning a bridge more than once. The feeling that follows is like the quiet after rain. You can hear roofs sighing. By the time the curfew bell leans over the town, the gossip is tired of its own voice. You bank the fire and lay out the clothes you mean to be seen in tomorrow, the ones that say tidy, harmless, industrious, generous in small ways. There is nothing weak about such armor. It keeps knives from being sharpened on your name. Before sleep, you say a small prayer that is mostly a wish for proportion. Let prudence be bold, and fear be brief, and tongues love the taste of kindness more than the thrill of invention. The room answers by cooling a few degrees, which you accept as assent. You close your eyes and let the house hold your secrets, which are mostly recipes and purchased nails. You start before dawn because the road respects the early and mocks the late. Dew slicks the ruts like polished bone, and the first thing your boots learn is that mud has more grip on you than you have on plans. You shoulder a pack, keep the cudgel where your hand expects it, and join a little caravan of neighbors who have also decided that safety looks a lot like company. No one says it, but everyone walks as if the hedges have ears. Travel here is not a line, it is a negotiation. Carts lurch, pack horses clink their bells, and the lane decides to be 2 lanes only when gossip needs to pass. A farmer warns you about the ford where stones roll their backs like lazy porpoises. A ferryman farther on will argue the river into obedience with a rope and a pole, then demand a fee that sounds like poetry until you count your purse. Tollkeepers wake brisker than roosters, each with a neat board of rates that grows suddenly elastic when your accent suggests you are in a hurry. You learn to greet them with cheer and exact coins. It is astonishing how often cheer helps the arithmetic. Bridges, when you find them, feel like miracles built out of patient rumor. Some wear chapels at mid-span, snug rooms where prayers and donations compete politely for attention. A brother there keeps a chalk list of who gave what for the upkeep. You put down a coin and enjoy the minor pleasure of being a line on a wall that is not a debt. The mainstream fact walks beside you with dry feet. Many medieval bridges were maintained by confraternities and endowed trusts, complete with bridge chapels and wardens, because a sound crossing is as holy as a clean well. On market eves, the chapel lamp makes the river look like it is carrying small stars downstream. Between bridges, the land makes other plans. Causeways cross marsh like patient commas. Wheel ruts hold yesterday's water and tomorrow's intentions. In a wood, the path narrows until your shoulders become advisors to bark. You keep to the crown of the road when you can, the ridge where carts have not hollowed travel into a trap. When hedges part, you see a smear of old stones keeping a stubborn line, the bone of a Roman road pretending nothing important has changed in 1,000 years. You love its arrogance and its hard mercy. Bandits prefer spots where the world funnels into a decision. The narrow way between bramble and bog. The bend where a traveler watches his feet instead of the trees. The far lip of a ford where water jokes about cold and depth at once. They are less romance than arithmetic. A man out of work after a levy ends. A youth angry at a reeve. A trio who like the sound coins make when they agree to move. Put them near an unguarded bridge in a quiet month, and you have a profession. You rehearse 3 rules. Walk together, talk little, and let your purse ride deep and dull, not high and proud. The watchful carry papers that smile on command. A letter of safe conduct looks like politeness wearing armor. With the right seal, a gate opens faster, a tollkeeper chooses mercy, and a patrol waves you through with professional boredom. When you lack seals, you lean on saints. A pewter badge of St. Christopher swings from your cap, because carrying the carrier of travelers feels like an inside joke the sky enjoys. The quirky trick you learned from an old carter is to tuck a single bright coin where a thief can find it and leave the rest stitched into your hat brim. Thieves with quick hands love quick rewards, and you prefer your cleverness where you can sit on it. Midday brings an inn that is only mostly real. 4 walls, a yard, a smell of ale that has argued successfully with other smells, and a hostler who can judge a horse's mood by the way its ears pronounce breakfast. You take straw by the fire and soup that has known better days, and you listen. Every road keeps its own newsletter. Someone saw men-at-arms 2 valleys over taking an interest in pigs that were not theirs. Someone else swears the ferry 2 bridges down is run by a man who can read weather by the tone of oarlocks. You store the useful, enjoy the improbable, and leave before the afternoon decides you belong to the bench. A fact with a sheriff's voice steps into the lane around you. An old statute orders hedges cut back and ditches cleared along highways so ambushes have fewer sympathizers. And when someone cries hue and cry, neighbors must join the chase or pay for their beds in fines. The law imagines an England where the road sees farther than malice. In practice, hedges grow while officials blink, and good intentions carry knives mostly for cutting bread. Historians still argue whether widespread highway robbery was a constant menace or an anxiety sharpened by royal rhetoric and flamboyant chronicles. Your blister votes that the danger is real enough when coin is scarce and men with spears are between jobs. Forests introduce their own rules. Royal law claims the king's peace for beasts and trees. And foresters wear green with the confidence of men who can make a fine appear out of leaves. You walk the ride where sunlight lays stripes across fern and path, clapping now and then because wolves believe confidence more than they believe arithmetic. A forester you know swears wolves hate bells. You test the theory with your pack horse and decide the bell mostly annoys you. Still, it punctuates the quiet in a way that makes the hair on your arms choose to behave. Bridges sometimes stage their own temper. On a windy day, the span lifts your stomach and lowers your opinions. You keep your eyes on the next pier and recite a psalm that fits the steps. In a thaw, frost makes boards remember their childhood in an icy stream. You shuffle and pretend grace. At a ferry, the deck lists just enough to inspire poetry in the unschooled. The boatman calls, "Wait to the center," and your friends suddenly remember how much they love the very middle of things. When it goes wrong, it goes quickly. You've seen a cart lean, a horse panic, and 4 men learn to swear in chorus. The safest speed is steady. You pass messengers who make the road smoke, and students who make it stop to argue about words. Pilgrims with cockle shells at their hats move like prayer with feet. A peddler sings a verse about needles and thread that lodges in your ear and sets up housekeeping. You let him, because a song you can hum is a map you cannot lose. When rain thinks about joining, you tie your cloak across chest and pack in a practiced knot, and remind yourself that a wet traveler who arrives is still a success story. Evening collects travelers the way a hedge collects birds. You reach a hospice run by canons who keep stew honest and beds honest enough, straw pallets named with letters that smell faintly of last night's pilgrim. The porter has a talent for deciding who snores, and he exiles likely thunderers to the far wall, a kindness for which you would happily grant him a bishopric. You eat, trade news, and trade silence. Before sleep, a brother reads a page about journeys and mercy, and you nod as if he wrote it for your blister. Not everything is menace. Once, crossing a high moor, you watched beacons spark along a ridge at dusk, messages passing faster than hooves, a chain of small suns making war and weather into rumors you could almost answer. Once, at a bridge chapel, a mason showed you the last stone he set that day and patted it like a sleepy child. Roads are danger lines, yes, but they are also stitching, joining villages into towns, markets into seasons, and strangers into stories that take up residence in your own. That is worth a sore foot and a wary glance at hedges. You sleep with your purse inside the bedclothes, and your cudgel under the straw where your hand will find it without asking. Outside, hooves ring once on the bridge, then fade. The river tells its long, repeating tale to people who think they prefer silence. You angle your hat against drafts and promise yourself that tomorrow you will leave before the inn begins to invent breakfast prices. The road waits, exactly as it always does, with new versions of the same old tests. You feel ready enough to call that luck, and prudent enough to call it practice. Night enters the byre like a polite inspector. You run a hand along the warm slope of a cow's ribs and listen to the slow machinery of contentment. Outside, the hedge combs the wind into small, tidy lines. It is a good hour to believe the world behaves. Then the geese lift their necks and pronounce a word older than grammar. You set the lantern higher. Geese do not do poetry. They do alarms. You step into the yard with a staff and the kind of confidence that notices where the gate latch actually is. The lane holds its breath. The woodline holds a darker breath. When a wolf is near, the night grows a second spine. Every hinge and twig suddenly remembers how to squeak. You have learned to weigh sounds the way a miller weighs flour. A fox makes mischief. A wolf makes mathematics. You count sheep, not because you are sleepy, but because a missing number is the exact size of your problem. Boars carry their own punctuation. A rustle becomes a sentence, a grunt becomes a comma with opinions, and then the underbrush parts, and the forest writes your name with two tusks. You back to the wall where a cart gives you dignity and leverage. Every swineherd you've ever met taught the same liturgy. Never corner a boar. Always give it an exit wider than its temper. Trust the spear only if the spear trusts you. You raise the torch and speak in a tone that says, both of us would enjoy not dying tonight. It is a surprisingly convincing tone. The boar considers, stamps, and chooses a different sentence. You exhale so slowly the cows forgive you for promising calm 5 minutes ago. The herd is your bank and your calendar. Cows whisper milk and traction. Sheep promise wool and small sermons. Pigs store forest into bacon the way a poet stores summer into vowels. You keep them behind thorn and wattle because hedges are honest fences that also feed bees. A mainstream fact warms your hands as you check the ties. Medieval communities put bounties on wolves and organized periodic hunts, and royal forests wrote whole paragraphs of law to protect deer from two-legged wolves, while shepherds simply tried to keep four-legged ones out with dogs and daylight. It is tidy on paper. On a damp hillside at moonrise, it is much less tidy. The dogs know their business. A big mastiff takes the gate like a living hinge. Smaller curs work the edges, more punctuation than prose, but useful punctuation. You praise their names until they swell with pride, which is the cheapest armor you can buy. You tie bells on a lead wether because one ringing sheep is easier to count than a silent flock, and you admit the word bellwether pleases you more than it has any right to. The quirky trick you picked up from an old shepherd is to hang scraps of tin from a fence where moonlight can flirt with them. The flicker bothers wolves, and if it does not, at least it entertains you. Danger does not always wear fur. Sometimes it wears a coat of invisibility, and a Latin name no one here uses. Murrain is the word on your street, a catch-all for the coughs and fevers that walk through a herd as if the gate were a rumor. A cow stops chewing and stares through you as if remembering a better field in a kinder world. A lamb sags, ears like tired flags. You separate the slow from the lively, with a gilt that could haul timber. You burn bedding, scrub troughs with salt, trade sleep for rounds in the byre. Historians still argue whether the moraines named in old records point to specific illnesses like rinderpest or foot and mouth, or whether the words simply gathered sorrows into one basket because naming each sorrow would have filled the day. You remember a winter when Mad Dog walked the lanes like a small, fast curse. People shut doors quickly and spoke more quickly still. A bite was a clock you could feel under your skin. Dogs were tied, then muzzled, then judged. Some towns posted rules as stern as any tax list, and the watch carried staves with more purpose than usual. You still check the dogs' mouths in warm weather, not because you expect foaming, but because prudence likes rituals. Fear teaches, and the lesson sticks even after the fear moves on. Forests give and take. In autumn you drive pigs to mast, letting them hoover up acorns and beech nuts until each looks like prosperity with hooves. Pannage is the practical gospel of the oak. You send a boy with a long stick and a whistle, and you count them out, and count them back, and decide religion needs more counting in general. The same woods keep wolf pits you would rather forget. Steep-sided traps that catch anything with more curiosity than caution. You keep them fenced because you have goats with advanced degrees in curiosity. You have a soft spot for the cow doctor who travels with a bag of smells and a notebook of advice written like weather reports. He blows tobacco smoke in a calf's nostril and swears it relocates demons, then prescribes clean water and rest, which you suspect is the actual medicine. He trims a hoof with the precision of a goldsmith and describes the angles like a sermon about straight paths. He leaves you with a new salve and a joke about fleas filing taxes. You treasure both. Some dangers come from kitchens, not hedges. Slaughter done in a hurry makes knives argue with fingers. You keep the blades like monks keep vows, sharp, clean, and respectfully housed. You scald pig bristles in a barrel that hisses like gossip, and keep children at the edge with jobs that feel important because they are. You salt meat as if you were writing a letter to February, and February actually reads its mail. A fact sits on the table with the brine. A bad winter with sick herds can roll a hunger year into a hunger 2 years, because the spring plow asks for muscle and hooves that illness already rented. Neighbors carry remedies the way some carry flint. One smears tar on sheep noses before driving through a damp valley because his grandmother said fog carries sulks. Another swears by a wreath of rowan over the byre door to turn envy aside. You test the practical first and the poetic second, and often keep both. A byre that smells of vinegar and thyme feels serious about life. A door with a red thread tied to the latch feels watched over, and sometimes feeling watched over is the medicine between medicines. On clear nights, you walk the fence line with a lantern lowered into your own shadow so your eyes can keep the world. Trees draw black lace against stars. The herd breathes like one animal with many names. Somewhere, far off, wolves practice the kind of music that makes every hair consider a career change. You do not answer. You count. You test each gate with a tug that says we survived today. Let us invest in tomorrow. Before sleep, you label the day's lessons out loud in the easy cadence that keeps fright small. Close early. Bell the weather. Boil the rope if it touched sickness. Praise the dogs even when they merely look noble. Stack thorn where a gap thinks about being tempting. Historians still argue whether wolves truly haunted the edges of busy towns, or whether chronicle writers loved a good shiver. Your geese vote for haunting, your ledger votes for hedges, and your pillow votes for a story with a quiet ending. You bank the stable lantern to an ember and leave the door on the latch that makes your hand confident in the dark. As you cross the yard, something moves in the hedge. It is only the cat attempting to collect a bonus. You award it, because morale is also a fence. The stars blink once, like a promise that does not mind being small, and the herd settles. You follow their example. Calm is a skill you practice, and tonight you practice well. Reputation travels faster than feet. You feel it move ahead of you like a breeze that decides doors before hands do. In a small town, names wear clothes. Some have good cloth that never seems to wrinkle. Some have patches that draw eyes before greetings. You have learned that the shortest road to warmth is not distance, but standing. And the worst cold is a polite door that never quite opens. You dress your name each morning the way you dress your body. Clean cuffs say you keep order even when work is muddy. A steady nod to the watch says you meet eyes, not just obligations. The Guildhall notices such grammar. Masters sit under carved beams and weigh apprentices with a scale you cannot see. Skill matters, yes, but so does supper talk, and whether your work leaves a clean line on the bench or a mess someone else will wipe. A mainstream fact steadies your hope here. Craft guilds in many towns controlled entry, wages, and training, creating ladders that could lift a careful worker from hired hands to a bench with his own mark. You carry that ladder in your mind when the week drags its heels. Parish life is the other cloak. You stand at baptisms with a candle, at funerals with a shoulder, at feast days with a spoon. The clerk writes your offerings in a book with slow letters that judge no one. Yet the book creates a shadow that follows your steps. You do not give to be seen, but being seen giving greases the quiet hinges that keep communities from squeaking. When the widow needs a roof beam raised, you show up, because timber remembers who lifted it, and so do people. Still, there is an economy of honor that can feel like a toll road. A tavern bench can go silent when a roomer walks in wearing your face. A reeve can decide your hedge is an inch too bold while another hedge brags at twice the height. You learn the craft of disproving with actions, not arguments. Fetch the last bucket from the well on cold nights. Offer a cart when a cart will save a day. Allow jokes at your expense and return them with seasoning, not spite. 2 seasons of that make malice look expensive. Class speaks softly, and everyone hears. The Lord Steward has a voice like folded parchment, and hands that never hurry. The merchant with 3 colors in his sleeves sits where light finds him first. The villain who owes labor blushes when coin is discussed, even if his grains are clean and his fences plumb. Yet you also notice the cracks where seedlings live. An apprentice who can read numbers like prayer becomes essential. A widow with a good eye for cloth becomes a broker without a signboard. A serf who buys out his labor with careful coin steps across a line that once looked like a wall. Historians still argue whether such crossings were rare enough to be legends or frequent enough to be the town's ordinary miracle. You practice alliances. The baker trusts your measure. The smith trusts your temper. The miller trusts you to question his thumb with humor rather than heat. You keep faith with those who keep faith with you, and you forgive in small denominations because you will need small forgiveness soon enough. The oddest currency you carry is your word. Once given, it spends years paying you back in tiny interests you cannot tally until a door opens at dusk, and a voice calls, "Come in. No need to knock." When standing phrase, the menders come with music rather than needles. A love day is called, one of those gentle arbitrations where food and witnesses share the table and old quarrels are laid between loaves until they soften. You bring a pie, listen more than you speak, and watch 2 red ears become 2 ears that will hear again tomorrow. The quirky custom that makes you smile is the rough music that sometimes greets a repeat offender of neighborly peace. Pots banged, pans clattered, a parade of noise that says manners matter with a tune no one admits knowing by heart. It is foolish and effective in equal parts. You also learn camouflage. The best charity in a touchy season is anonymous. A small sack left at a threshold is grain. A name attached is politics. You write occasional petitions for neighbors who speak plainly but do not write. And you sign your own name small, because big names cast long shadows, and you have seen men trip over shadows more than stones. You nurse no ambition except usefulness, and usefulness is the ambition that makes rooms remember you kindly. Sumptuary laws drift through from time to time like chilly fashions from grander streets. This trim but not that. This color for marks of office. That fur for purses that sing. You obey with a grin because you know the best display is clean boots and a laugh that lands well. Historians still argue whether these clothing rules were mostly theater or truly policed with zeal. You suspect theater, because even stewards tire of measuring hems when the harvest calls louder. Honor also lives in thresholds. You knock before noon when you need help, so your request sounds like work rather than debt. You host on saints' days beyond your means never, within your means often, and you sit where you can refill cups quickly so you can steer talk like a ferryman. You keep a small book of favors in your head and a larger book of forgetting in your heart. Both are needed. The first to build bridges, the second to keep them from tolling every crossing. On hard mornings the cold door appears again, and you stand in front of it with a basket of eggs and a sentence that has practiced its manners. Sometimes it opens because you have been boringly reliable for a long time, which is the finest compliment your town can give. Sometimes it stays shut because someone important woke with a stone in his shoe. You nod, you try another door, you place the eggs where they can do good elsewhere, and you walk home with your posture intact. A fact worth repeating. Towns eat reputations whole and slowly change their minds. Persistence is the spoon that feeds them. You end the day with your ledger of kindnesses and small repairs. A hinge oiled, a quarrel eased, a child taught the neatest way to coil a rope. You set your good shirt to air and your work shirt to soak, and you thank the quiet that comes when a name has behaved itself. The lane breathes, the hearth agrees. You are not famous, and that is the safest fame. You bank the fire and let the town hold you exactly as you have chosen to be held. By the hand, not by the throat. Set the cup down. Let your shoulders loosen, then loosen again, as if you were unlacing a stubborn boot. The lane outside no longer argues. It purls, a soft thread drawn through cloth. Somewhere far across the roofs, a curfew bell remembers one slow note and lets it fade into the beams above your bed. You breathe as the town breathes, unhurried even, a tide that knows both shore and moon. Picture the ember in the hearth, a small planet with patient seasons. Ash drifts like pale weather over red hills. The iron poker lies where you left it, a thin horizon you do not have to cross again tonight. Dogs sigh in their sleep and return to herding clouds. In the byre, cattle fold their legs into the warmth they have made for themselves, and the timbers of the roof answer with tiny clicks like distant crickets. All the day's edges round off. The road's ruts fill with starlight instead of water. The mill wheel slows to a hum you can tuck behind the ear like a lullaby. The river tells its long rehearsal of tomorrow, and you decide not to argue with rivers anymore. Even the gossip thins to kindness when it dreams. Even the watchman counts peace like steps and finds he prefers it. Let small, ordinary mercies settle on you, one by one. Bread that held together. A bucket that did not spill. A name that returned home without picking up thorns. Lay each on the shelf beside the bed until the shelf grows soft with plenty. What you did today was enough. What remains can wait for the light. Now imagine the door bar lowered with a gentle clack. Imagine the shutter drawn just so, leaving one slender seam for the night to look in and see that all is well. Turn your face toward the cooler side of the pillow, let your hands grow heavy, and listen as the house remembers its promise. Sleep first, answers later. The ember dims like an eyelid. The town drifts with you. Good night.